morning, everybody. Happy Friday. My name is Jessica Kubicki. I am with the Housing Collective. We support the homeless response system for all of Western Connecticut. And we are so excited to start a three-part series focused entirely on landlord engagement, landlord relationships, and really the value that this brings to the work that we do around housing for our communities, and actually for the population as well. So for our first series, I'm really excited to introduce Dana Serra, who is the Director of Leased Housing Programs at Waterbury Housing Authority. She is a wealth of knowledge around all things when it comes to housing choice vouchers, which are also referred to as Section 8s. I want to thank you all for being here. Please note that we have two more series coming up over the next 2 months. If you haven't had a chance, you're welcome to go to our website, which I will list in the chat in a second for you all. For the second and third date webinar, but these are also recorded and will be posted for you all to access. One other little housekeeping before I turn it over to Dana. If you have any questions, which we absolutely welcome throughout the presentation, there is a Q&A box at the bottom. Please put those all in. I will be monitoring throughout the presentation. If it's anything that feels necessary, I will interrupt Dana during it, but most likely we'll get to most of our questions at the end of the session. And I promise we will not go over 11 o'clock. I will not take 1 minute longer than that. And so we are so thankful again to have you. And Dana, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to talk to what I believe the audience of some landlords, hopefully some that we've worked with, some maybe that aren't familiar with Section 8 and looking to maybe get some new information, and maybe even just some of our providers who do this and day in and day out and probably want to be like, hey, I want to learn a little bit more about subsidies as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Good morning. Just a little background of me is I've been with the Waterbury Housing Authority for over 30 years. Lots of changes going around, and HUD is a lot stricter with a lot of our policies, procedures, inspections, and things like that. So a lot of stuff is going to be changing, but as far as the Section 8 program, I'm going to share my presentation, which is, oh, I don't think, okay, sorry. So this is our landlord outreach. It's a PowerPoint that we have on our website, and I can have Jessica send everything to you guys. As far as my resources that I use. Our landlord outreach it's just a PowerPoint, but it's a informative thing of what your role as the landlord is. Kind of getting into the nitty gritty of it is the role of the landlord in the Housing Choice Voucher Program is to provide decent, safe, and affordable housing to a tenant at a reasonable rent. Basically, the dwelling unit must pass the program's housing quality standards and be maintained to those standards as long as the landlord receives a housing assistance payment. Big changes are coming with this part of it for the housing quality standard. It's called Inspire. There is a link on the HUD website that's definitely different than what we have right now. And again, HUD is being very strict on making sure that those units are decent and safe. In addition to that, to provide whatever the leases between the tenant and the landlord, anything in that. And then there's a HAP contract between the Public Housing Authority and the landlord. We'll get into that. There's a later slide. So most common landlord violations is failing to maintain a unit. Again, we talked about this new Inspire that's going to be coming. Landlord is responsible for maintenance and upkeep of the unit. make sure that the repairs, which are the landlord's responsibility, are made in a timely manner to avoid an abatement in payment. Accepting payments for a vacant unit if a family moves out of the unit and the landlord doesn't notify the housing authority, that's a huge violation. And demanding or accepting side payments. We see that a lot of landlords don't like what we can approve based on HUD guidelines. And they will ask the family to sign something on the side or just accept, extra payments. That is an absolute violation of the program. So housing quality standards, these are just basic things that we look for. And in all of our packets, we do give the landlord this checklist. And I do want to stress that before we go out to do an inspection, you should be reading through all this and making sure that these are done beforehand and they're going to pass. Not passing inspection at initial is a waste of time for you. It's a waste of time for the tenant. It's a waste of time for, the inspectors, and then it's a waste of time for Section 8. Everything with Section 8 is time sensitive. And, tenants only have a certain amount of time to find a unit and to get leased up. And, the delays in having to go out to do multiple inspections ends up being a problem. So these are important, but usually we give everything to the landlord prior to. So landlord responsibilities, basically the basic landlord responsibility is complying with all of the landlord's obligations under the housing authority, housing assistance payment, the HAP contract, and the lease. I'm gonna just go deviate to the next because this is quite important. There's landlords, tenants, and housing authority. These are the three peoples that are involved in three different types of contracts. So the tenant gets a voucher. The voucher is between the tenant and the housing authority. Once we approve a unit, the unit then becomes where we do a HAP contract between the housing authority and the landlord. And then the lease is strictly between the landlord and the participant. A copy is required to be in the tenant's file. The lease is signed by the landlord and the tenant only. Waterbury Housing Authority has no rights to anything within the lease. I don't have any jurisdiction over that because it's not our signature. So I want to go back a little. So maintaining the unit, again, complying with equal opportunity requirements, preparing and furnishing the PHA information required on the HAP contract, collecting the security deposit, the tenant rent, and any charges for the unit damaged by the family. Again, security deposits and tenant rent are not our responsibility. It's between the tenant and the landlord. So you really do need to enforce anything within your dwelling lease. Paying for utilities and services that are not the responsibility of the family as specified in the lease. Allowing reasonable modifications to a dwelling unit occupied or to be occupied by a disabled person, and complying with the Violence Against Women's Act, the VAWA. So we talked about that. So as far as with Section 8, it's beneficial to a landlord because the tenant pays 30% of his or her monthly income, less the utilities toward the rent. So basically it's under 30%, that meaning that you would be getting the, 70 to 80% of the contract rent that you are approved for. You collect the tenant's portion of the rent from the tenant. The Waterbury Housing Authority pays the assistance, meaning the HAP, the difference between the tenant rent and the contracted rent amount, directly to you. We do suggest that you do direct deposit just because that would be the easiest way to get your money as fast as possible. We try to send the checks out by the first of the month. Sometimes that gets a little bit difficult, but, you know, if it falls on the weekend, but usually the checks are by the first of the month. And once housing determines the contract rent for the unit, no other additional monies can be collected from the tenant. Security deposit is between the landlord and the tenant. You know, Waterbury Housing or any public housing authority does not assume anything for the security deposit. And you cannot charge an assisted tenant more than you would charge an unassisted tenant. It's based on state and local laws. I believe in Connecticut, you can charge up to 2 full months contract rent to a tenant. You can also ask for a co-signer, if the tenant can't do the security deposit. But basically that's what you would be able to do for the security deposit. I don't know how many agencies actually help with security deposit anymore. Now incorporated in Waterbury was an agency that did help us, but I'm not sure of the funding of that at this point. So when a voucher holder is interested in your unit, basically, these are the steps that you would go through. The landlord screens the tenant. Again, Waterbury Housing Authority does not go through all of this. We only approve them based on eligibility for the HUD program. So we don't know credit wise, anything like that, if they're a good tenant. Again, if they don't have great credit and that's a criteria for you to do a screening, my suggestion is to possibly do a co-signer for that tenant, just so that you're not finding that you're not able to collect the rent from the landlord, I mean, from the tenant. The other thing is to stay on top of the tenant. Do not let them go too long based on your lease, without paying rent. It's very important for you to enforce your lease, because if you don't, and then the tenant decides they want to leave, and then you contact us and say they're not in good standing, but it was from a year ago that they didn't pay you the rent, there's really not much we're able to do. Again, enforcing your lease is the best way of keeping the tenant, you know, accountable for their actions based on your unit, with the inspection part of it, with, you know, any damages to the unit, any unpaid rents, anything like that. The request for lease approval is the form that the landlord is going to fill out. At that point, it's a HUD document. There's a whole packet that we give that inspection checklist with that as well. There's a lead paint document that goes with that, but it's very self-explanatory, and it usually, you know, we're always available to help. But that would be where you would put the specified unit, whatever contract rent you want, whatever the security deposit you want to ask for the tenant, and then good contact information for us to contact you. Once that's submitted, we go in and we approve the contract rent. The Waterbury Housing Authority has a rent reasonable study to determine if the rent is affordable. Since COVID, rents have kind of skyrocketed, and it's actually preventing some tenants, even market renters, from renting from you as a landlord. And it becomes very difficult for a tenant to be able to find a unit, not only in Waterbury, but I know in the state of Connecticut, we're having this problem where the housing stock is not what it used to be. And, you know, the landlords are, you know, wanting exceptional rents. And, you know, I know that everything is increased, but it's increasing on all the tenants as well. So we just do need to determine whether the contract rent is reasonable. Once it's approved, if we deny a contract rent, we will work with the landlord to see if they will accept something less, or, you know, kind of try to work on something that would be, you know, acceptable to both. Once it's acceptable, we'll put it in for an inspection. The unit will be inspected to ensure that it meets that HQS, which is also the Inspire that I talked about before. Just some notes on the inspection. I may have touched on it before, but making sure that you look at the inspection checklist and prior to saying that the unit is ready, that you really look at that checklist and make sure that we have the unit will pass. There will be some things that the inspector finds that, we may either have you do it while you're there, if it's something minor, that way we can pass it, or we can just do another inspection. But the utilities do need to be on for the inspection. They need to be in the landlord's name, not the tenants, because the tenants don't have access to that unit at that point. So it would always be on in the owner's name at that point. The inspection company will contact the landlord directly to schedule an inspection for the initial inspection, usually within 5 days by the time the request for lease approval and the contract rent has been approved. We only allow 2 inspections to be completed. So if it fails to meet the HQS, the tenant will be instructed to find another unit. That's why I'm stressing that the checklist that you see is very specific to what we're looking for. You make sure that those things are looked at and they're going to pass the first time. Then the next step, once it passes an inspection, we do a lease and contract. As we talked about, the lease is between you and the landlord and the tenant. And the HAP contract is between the housing authority and the landlord. A lease, we will, once we have the approved rent and everything, we will submit to the landlord a letter verifying what needs to be on the lease. So basically, it's just the address needs to match, the contract rent needs to match, the dates that we determine that that's when the lease up will be. So in order for you to list a unit, in Waterbury, we usually use affordablehousing.com. You can go in and list your unit. There's an owner's tab and then it lists your property. That's where we direct our tenants to go to in order to find a unit that's available. You can also contact a real estate agent. The real estate agent could they could help you find a tenant if you're not in Waterbury. But you can use a real estate agent. You can do a local newspaper where you put it in. Not sure how many people actually use the newspaper anymore, but affordablehousing.com is really one of the best things that that we're looking at. So deconcentration, encouraging the use of the vouchers for families to locate in neighborhoods that will improve the life opportunities of family members. We're looking at access to better schools and services, more networks through which to gain access to services and employment, looking for low levels of crime and violence and access to better jobs. So we're trying to better the community and support the community. And, this is just a way of, maybe reaching out to landlords that have, maybe aren't in the downtown area, maybe that are outside, like closer to Wolcott or Watertown. And, really having the landlords look at renting to Section 8 and being, willing to rent to Section 8. Not all Section 8 is a bad tenant. Don't think of Section 8 as being you're going to have problems with the landlord or with the tenant and you're going to have to, do an eviction. If you do your screening properly, as you would with any other, someone unassisted, you will find people that are on the up and up. And that, I also suggest that landlords go to, visit the homes of the people and kind of say, I'll bring you the application or whatever. You're going to see how that tenant lives. That's really something that some landlords do, some don't, but it's kind of takes it under advisement, because you look at someone and how they're living, and, there's a hoarding situation or whatever. You're gonna know what that tenant is. You still have to use equal opportunity, fair housing, all that kind of stuff. But, it is your option to get a tenant that's going to work well with you. Tenants that are not responsive, you want to make sure that they're, responding to your emails, your texts, whatever, to make sure that you are not finding a tenant that's not going to be, in good communication with you. So some basic program requirements, when a family applies, the landlord is responsible for screening the family and deciding whether to lease the family, just as the landlord would with any potential assisted tenant. The public housing has no liability or responsibility to the landlord or other person in the families with the family's behavior or suitability for tenancy. Again, you really want to make sure that you are screening these tenants, that it's a good fit with you, just as the tenant will be doing as the landlord. If you're not responsive to the tenant and they have to try and find you for like the most basic of the initial lease up, the tenant may not want to lease from you because they may not be able to ever get in contact you, and then this is just a bad situation. If the landlord is willing, the landlord family will complete the request for tenancy approval. When submitting to the PHA, this document is the first step in the process of obtaining approval for the family to receive financial assistance. Again, this is something that we're gonna ask for. If you're a new landlord, we're gonna ask for a deed, we're gonna ask for tax ID information. That won't be given to the tenant, that will be just given directly to the Waterbury Housing Authority or the Public Housing Authority. We determine that the proposed rent is reasonable. The selected unit must meet the housing quality standards, the inspection. So as a participant and as a landlord for the housing authority, and ongoing, after the initial lease is a full year, we do annual recertifications with the tenant to determine if they're eligible, or still eligible, and we do an annual inspection. Can't stress enough that, again, making sure that you stay in contact with the tenant, that you make sure that you have, met any needs, if they have any damages or anything like that, that it's done before annual inspection. The housing authority will not abate the unit, if it's tenant caused, but we will, if we have an item that's a landlord's responsibility, we will end up, if you don't respond to us and fix the unit within either 24-hour period, if it's a emergency situation, or a 30-day period, if you don't respond to us, we will abate the unit, meaning that we will hold the payment. We will not reissue that payment until we have a passing inspection, meaning we will not go retro. We will only pay once the unit passes inspection at that date. It only takes one deficiency for a unit to fail an inspection. Failed units require a reinspection. Re-inspections cost money and time to both you and to the housing authority and to the inspectors. You can help save time and money by doing your own inspection prior to us going out. The PHA will charge a $25 fee for failed re-inspections when the landlord notifies the Public Housing Authority that a repair has been made, but the deficiency has not been corrected, and when the time for repairs has elapsed and the deficiency has not been corrected. You can request an annual rent increase. You need to follow the directions on the letters, but it will not be automatically approved. We do need to have a passing inspection at this point. And if we don't, we can deny your request. That's basically what will need to happen. You need to make sure that you, have passing inspection and that you are in good standing with the housing authority. Another thing, enforce your lease. I can't stress it enough. It's your responsibility to enforce your lease. The housing authority doesn't do, can't do that for you. We're not property managers. And when I say we're not property managers, it means that we are not the go-between. We don't, call the tenant and tell them you need to be, you need to abide by your lease, you need to pay your landlord. Yes, it's a violation of the Section 8 department, in the program, but, the only thing that we can do is just tell them they're not going to be renewed, that they're going to be terminated. But what that does is we just stop the HAP payment between the housing authority and the tenant. The tenant will still occupy the unit. You still have to go through your eviction. So I stress that you do need to enforce your lease, make sure you keep good records for your ledgers for the tenants, that you make sure that you are, contacting the tenant, going to the unit if you can. If you don't live there, you have someone that drives by, making sure that you're, answering your phone if there is any issues. Other than that, I mean, I've gone through basically what your responsibilities are as a landlord, what the Section 8 department, is responsible for. I don't think I have much else. I probably talked too long, but, thank you, Jessica.
Oh, no,
Um,
that was great. We actually did get a question,
okay.
and a good question, actually. Um,
Oh,
so it appears that the requirements to maintain the unit in good standing puts full responsibility on the landlord. Why not also have that same requirement for the tenant when the inspection is completed and accepted and the tenant creates a problem and damages the property? It should be the tenant's responsibility to repair the damage, right?
yeah.
Like he's asking question mark or
Yes. Yeah. So yes, exactly. So when we do our briefings with our initial briefings to our tenants, we usually stress that they need to make sure that they have good communication skills with the landlord to make sure that if there's damage done or there's something in the unit that they need to get fixed, then the landlord, they are in good communication with the landlord. Tenants are told that they need to make sure that they keep the unit in good condition. That if they're going to move out, it's good wear and tear. It's nothing more than that. That's why I suggest that you go to units more than once a year or just more than never really, because if you don't go to a unit, you're never going to see what that tenant has been doing. We can go out and we can do our annual research or our annual inspection, and we can tell the tenant, this is a violation of yours, you have to fix it. Is the tenant going to fix it? Are they capable of it? Are they going to be at the level of what you want your unit to be fixed at? So sometimes the tenant and the landlord can work together if they've worked together throughout the year to fix whatever. If there's a pet and you allow pets and the tenant, has pet damage, then, you're going to know that before we go out to do the inspection. We will hold the tenant accountable for their tenant responsibility of the inspection. However, again, is it at your, what you expect of a repair that you would normally do, or is the tenant gonna, put up a, purple door because that's what they have access to, and you don't want that as, when they move out. So it's working with the tenant. Again, it goes back to really having good communication with the tenant, and making sure you go to the unit when you can. We do stress on our end that they have to, abide by our rules. Our rules are that you are eligible, you report your income to us, that you keep with our appointments, and that you do keep the unit at a, with no damages. However, we can't enforce that because that's not the lease between us and the landlord.
So I think a follow-up question that I would like to ask then, and maybe goes along with this, right? I think there are certainly instances, and maybe based off of that specific question, where landlord's done everything, right? And unfortunately, there is still some level of damage due to the tenant. Is or does Waterbury Housing Authority have any financial assistance on mitigation, or do you all like refer landlords anywhere when it comes to that side?
No, that's a great question, and I don't believe we have anything like that. We can stop the abatement if it's the tenant's responsibility, so we wouldn't stop the payment if it's the tenant's responsibility, which is helpful because at least you're getting the HAP contract or the HAP amount. But there's really, I mean, as far as the only thing I can say is enforce your lease. You know what I mean? If the tenant is not doing what they need to do, then you need to get them out sooner rather than later. And again, if you are in contact with the tenant throughout the year, you're gonna know those kind of things. You're gonna know that, you can enforce the lease by non-payment of rent if they're behind. You can also work with them with any kind of damages and, you can put them on a repayment agreement. Us at the housing authority that has our public housing units, we will put a tenant on a repayment agreement for any damages done. And then that way their landlord is getting the money, but they're also holding the tenant accountable.
Awesome. I
Mhm.
think the other thing I will note, um, because I think financially, obviously, it's incredibly challenging. And going back to kind of the communication and relationships, the next session that we have in June is actually going to be on the service side. So I think the other opportunity, if it is a client that's working with the homeless response system, um, they hopefully have somebody that they're working with and can be also that additional liaison. That's obviously not going to help on the financial side per se, but going back to your point, Dina, I think could be supportive in addressing some of those challenges more in real time so that the unit isn't a complete absolute chaos right at the end of the lease. And or there are times where we've worked with you all at the housing authority and landlords where we understand that, you know what, this could end up being that way and we move them out ahead of time, right? Like those types of
Exactly,
situations.
exactly.
Awesome. Um, I Oh, I think this is more of a statement, but a very accurate one that we hear a lot of times. Section 8 just getting a bad rap. And it's I'm assuming kind of due to a few bad actors and the huge landlord responsibility.
Mhm.
Is there any, I'm gonna turn this into a question too, because I think that statement is accurate, right? I think everybody heard
Absolutely.
that. What are the benefits? Like why would somebody work with a Section 8? And then I'm going to answer it from the service side if that's okay, but I want to hear from the maybe the financial side too.
Okay. So yes, financially, like I discussed before, a tenant is not responsible for the full market rent. They are responsible for only up to 30% of their income of that tenant or that contract rent. So basically, a landlord is getting 70 to 80% of the full contract rent every month from the housing authority. Yes, there's a lot of responsibility on the landlord but in any circumstance. So the financial burden of having a fair market renter where they're paying the full contract rent, if they stop paying you and they give you, they destroy your unit and you have all this damages at the end, it's beneficial to have the housing, the public housing authority be paying 70 or 80% of that contract rent for you. So financially, it's good. Public, for the responsibility of the housing authority is to enforce the tenant to stay in good standing with the program. So we could potentially not threaten, but threaten, you're going to be terminated. You know what I mean? And if you want the subsidy, you need to make sure you abide by your lease. You need to abide by making sure there's no damages in the unit. Again, screening a tenant is the biggest thing to make sure. And granted, it's not foolproof because we all know that someone could present as the greatest person and you don't feel like you're ever going to have a problem. You could potentially have a problem with that tenant. So that's basically my answer is financially, you get the majority of the contract rent from the tenant or from the housing authority, not the tenant.
I think that's huge, honestly, because I think to your point, you or I could present to any landlord, right? And I could lose my job tomorrow and no longer be able to pay rent, right? And then that's the entire rent. So I
Mhm.
think in some, there are some possibility, or at least benefits, I should say,
Right.
to working with our local housing authorities. The other, and I'm going to be such a broken record, right? But like, again, anyone can present really well to units. And
Mhm.
you're taking a gamble no matter what. And we get that, right? And I think you all do as landlords. The housing authority does their own background check, right? And they have to go through their own kind of rigorous review of the kind of applicant or tenant or whatever, but you all do whatever you do as well as landlords. Um, you know, we offer support in a way that someone else that presents to you all wouldn't come with. And so while we, I think, will be the first to say we can't prevent everything from happening, right? There's lots of clients that we work with that unfortunately still have challenges that occur. But I think there are a lot of instances where we can intervene. And it's successful. Whether it's moving the client out, whether it's rehousing them, whether it's, kind of not threatening, but nicely saying, you don't want to lose your
Mhm.
housing. And because once you
Mhm.
lose a Section 8, it's really hard to get it back. And I think a lot of people feel like it's the gold for sure. Um, okay,
Yeah.
so we have another. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dana. Do you want to?
No, I was just gonna say, in my briefings, use as, the golden ticket. Willy Wonka,
Yeah.
you got the golden ticket, you waited for years to get onto this. In section 8, the way that you get on the waiting list is by a lottery. And in the last time we actually accepted applications was in 2016. So I'm still working off of that waiting list. So that tells you how
We're
long
almost at
people have
10
to sit.
years.
We had over 10,000 people that applied. We chose 2,000. And I'm still working on that 2,000 list. So it's no joke. Like, you don't want to waste that opportunity that you just got, that golden ticket.
Yeah.
So that's how I stress it in my briefings with tenants. So
Yeah.
hopefully I can add something to that, they are going to lose Section 8 if they don't do, if they're not on the up and up and in good standing with both the program and their lease.
Yeah. Good point. Can you provide recommended screening questions, steps, or guidelines?
I think in one of and I think in one of the things, Jessica, I don't know if you're gonna present, or put the PowerPoint, but it is up on
Yes,
your
I can do that.
website. Yeah, the screening things would be is, I would say, go to attendance if you could, go to their current unit. Screening questions, you can Google some. I mean, fair housing, I don't think really would have a problem with you asking certain things, as long as, and I stress this, you are asking the same questions to someone that doesn't have Section 8. You have to be fair across the board, and you have to make your decisions fairly across the board. You can do a credit check. We don't, with Section 8, we only do a criminal check. And basically, for right now, a lifetime sex offender is the only one that we automatically deny. Tenant
What
or
about arson? I thought arson was too.
No,
No.
no. I mean,
Okay.
it's in our policy. I mean, if we have a pattern of it, obviously, you know what I mean? But certainly landlords can ask that. Me as a landlord, I don't ask that, on my public housing side, but I mean, it's a valid question, you know what I mean? But basically you want to make sure that you, are doing it fairly across the board for assisted or not assisted.
Great. So more of a statement of clarification than a question. So I think when you were talking about security deposits, can you just clarify for a person over the age of 62, security deposits are only equal to 1 month's rent? Is that correct?
I personally, because I don't work with security deposits and it has changed, I know that the state of Connecticut is 2 full contract rents. I don't know if it's specific to an age. I really don't know. I mean, I suggest that if a landlord is willing to, accept someone in and the person is presenting that, hey, I just cannot come up with the 1 or 2 months, I've requested, or I've suggested to landlords, maybe put them on a payment plan on that, where they give you a down payment, but then every month they give you like a portion of the security deposit. We're working with low-income families and elderly that, don't have the resources. So, being more flexible as a landlord and not just saying, nope, this is what it is, and I'm moving to the next person. If you like the person that, the applicant that you're, reviewing and, before you accept them, work with them, try to work with them on a payment plan or something like that, just so that you're giving everyone the affordability to, to be able to rent your unit.
Perfect. And the answer is yes. So
Yes.
technically it is 1 month security for anybody over the age of 62.
Oh, okay, okay,
Um,
thank you.
yeah,
I
well, just
understand
because
that.
we deal
Yeah,
with security deposits. So
yeah,
yes,
yeah,
anyone
yeah,
else, it's
okay,
the contracted 2 months.
right.
I actually just have one of my own questions on something that I hear a lot. And then of course, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. Um, we hear a lot that, well, the payment standards just really don't match up to what the rents are. And I think we already talked about the financial benefits of working with a subsidy, maybe with an understanding that it could be less. And I get that that could be a risk for a landlord. But I think it would be helpful maybe for you just to dive in briefly. What are the factors that you take into consideration when you're identifying the rent amounts? Because I think people see the max amount and they assume that's what they should be getting. And then there's normally a discrepancy, right, with what you all end up actually saying is the rent, the contracted rent that's allowed for the unit, right? And I think there's some misunderstanding or just like I don't understand. Like, how did you get there? So what do you guys do in that situation?
So for us, HUD publishes in September, they publish fair market rents. Okay, they base it based on the state, based on the census and all that kind of stuff. So like for Waterbury, our fair market rents are a number. Okay, so our fair market rent for 2025 was for a 1 bedroom, I'll do a 2 bedroom because that's probably is $1,445.
For
That does not,
Waterbury, just to
for
keep it.
Waterbury only, yes, thank you again. So $1,445. That's the fair market rent that HUD publishes. As a housing authority, we can go up to 110% of that. We could request 120% like for a reasonable accommodation for someone that needs a unit, they're renting from a family member. And they need the higher because they just did all of this work for wheelchair accessibility and all that kind of stuff. We could go up to 120% of, but it's a reasonable accommodation. The tenant has to go through it, they have to be approved. So that $1,445 now becomes $1,589 that we could potentially approve a contract rent. We can never go over what the 110% of those fair market rents are. The issue comes if the landlord does not want to include all utilities. So now that $1,589 is minus whatever the HUD approved utility allowance that we do at the same time we do the fair market rents. We publish them all in October. So come October, that $1,589, if it passes the rent reasonable study, according to the assessor's office in Waterbury, because that's why we use the affordablehousing.com website. It pulls right from the assessor's office. So it's more accurate. But from there, the utility allowance, if the landlord does not include all utilities, then now we go down in utilities. I mean, you obviously all know Eversource right now, all electric could be up to $400 for a 2 bedroom. So we're now looking at like a $1,200 rent approval, whereas you're looking at it's $1,589. That's what you want. We don't ever look at it that way. We will work with the landlord and we could go potentially higher because a tenant could pay up to 40% of their income. at initial. And then, but it gets into what happens if we approve the tenant at that point and then they lose their job and we went over, over the amount of the 30%. Now it's the tenant's responsibility. So if the tenant should only be paying $0 or a $10 rent, but then we approved the landlord to get an extra $200 on top of the rent. Now that tenant is still responsible for that $200, regardless of what their income is, they're still responsible for that $200 over. And now we're setting up the tenant for failure. And then they're not going to be able to pay the rent. And then it becomes more of a liability than it is. So I believe in my process, and other housing authorities may give you the full maximum amount, but we are working with family housing, low income family housing, and it's really to benefit the tenant. And you are getting the 80% of that, that rent. But I will work with landlords. Some landlords come to me and say, I just redid the kitchen, I just redid the bathroom, we just did all the lead paint, and all that's all remedied and things like that. I can look and put it as above average rather than an average in my rent reasonable study. And then I work with landlords that way, and I can approve more, but it's a process, and if you're bare bottom, you're just getting that you want the tenant to move in and you're not doing your due diligence of doing any upgrades, then you're gonna get bare minimum but we are willing to work with you. We're willing to work with landlords. It's not the end all, but I most likely will not be paying the $15.89 that you all see, but I will be paying, what I can and I think is affordable. And, to both
Yeah.
tenant and
Oh, that's
landlord.
helpful. I think just for people to understand and also have that kind of realistic expectation when going in as well.
Right. Mhm.
Um, do you all, and I feel like I know this answer, but do you administer RAPs?
No, John DeMille Associates, the state of Connecticut. But
Right. Okay.
yeah, and they
Um,
have their Waterbury through Waterbury as well.
Correct. Their main
Yeah.
office is in Waterbury. Yeah.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
don't know if you know this then, but are there any differences that landlords should be aware of when working with a RAP tenant versus a Section 8?
I believe that the wrap is up to 40%. So the tenant is already starting at 40%, not the 30% that Section 8 does. I
Got it.
think that's the only difference, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would say, at least from my understanding, RAPs are state funded,
Yeah,
right?
okay.
So
Yep.
you can't leave the state of Connecticut,
Right.
whereas obviously Section 8 you can.
Go
Um,
anywhere.
yeah, my understanding is
Mhm.
very similar.
Mhm.
So sorry, I know somebody asked that, and I don't know if that was exactly the best answer, just because we don't have JDA here.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
all right, so I don't see any other questions. I think what I'd love to do is invite my awesome other colleague, Jared, into the conversation. We are really grateful to the United Way of Greater Waterbury for kind of co-hosting and facilitating this series, and would love to allow you to kind of close us out.
Great. Well, thanks, Jess. I appreciate the great work that you're doing here in the region in Western Connecticut on the housing front and really supporting some great programming. And we're really fortunate to partner with folks like Dana at the Waterbury Housing Authority, who has been doing this work for a really long time. Can't really emphasize enough the great importance of partnership and building relationships with our landlords in the community who do really great work. And sometimes, in many cases, are really some of the unsung heroes that are supporting some folks who are most vulnerable in our community. Really grateful for the work that they're doing. I can't tell you how many times, from my perspective, as a former housing provider, how vital those relationships are, but also as a landlord myself, knowing what it is and what it's like to have property, and making sure that we're getting the right tenants for the right fit to ensure that the folks that we're working with are stably housed and are being supported. So once again, really can't thank all of you for the partnership. Dana, your insightful presentation was really helpful, giving us the information that we need to really support our consumers, but also more equally as important. I wouldn't say more important, but equally as important, really supporting our fabulous landlords in the greater Waterbury area that are doing this work and are often unsung heroes. So can't thank you all enough. Jess, thanks for your leadership. And we at the United Way are most proud to partner with the Housing Collective, ensuring that we're supporting some of the most vulnerable and deserving of these vouchers and really great units here in the greater Waterbury area and throughout the state of Connecticut. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jared. The last thing I'm just going to leave you all with, our next session is on June 13th, 10 o'clock as well. That one's going to focus on the service side. And then our last one, which will be in July, we're actually going to bring in a couple landlords. So very much hoping it's going to be kind of a peer-to-peer opportunity for you to hear directly from landlords that are working with these low income households who have subsidies and their experience as well. So we really appreciate you all taking the time. Dana, I cannot thank you enough again. It is such a
Okay.
pleasure. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Friday and weekend. Thanks
Thank you,
all.
everyone. Thank you.